No problem at all, Rachel, if you let me have your address, I will see how close you are to some of our home visit people on Tuesday and maybe drop it to you on Tuesday, through the door, or if you're some distance, I'll post it to you, full stop.
Hi, Angela.
Hello, lovely to see you, Mary. Hi, Joe.
Hi there. Hi,
How's it
Angela.
going? Getting all set.
Mary's getting all excited.
Yeah,
Perfect.
these before.
She's getting very excited.
Oh, well, you'll be really. Father Nicholas is planning another one near Christmas on Christmas traditions. So, yeah. Well, we just thought everybody's at home, and what a lovely thing to do, because he gives really good talks. So, actually, we'll stop talking about you now, Father. Here.
Nice to see you. How are you?
Yeah,
Fine,
good,
thank you.
good.
Fine, thank you, Father.
Stuff just had dinner, so this will be nice. Yeah.
Oh,
Hey, is there a lot of people watching, Angela?
at the moment, we've just got the 5 of us, but I'm expecting a few more through.
Yeah, very good.
Yeah, lovely. You must be delighted your daughter's moving over near Uxbridge.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We don't
Yeah, that'd be
the way
lovely.
up to Laverick Grove. We started moving all our stuff in bit by bit.
Yeah.
Because she's selling the flat, so hopefully it'll all go through before Christmas.
Brilliant.
The buyers already got the mortgage, so I don't know what the hold up is. As always,
Paperwork.
So,
It's just pure paperwork.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
it's got a big difference here in our house with them moving in and a baby on its way. Yeah,
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's wonderful. Absolutely wonderful.
lovely. Yeah.
When's the baby actually due? Remind me.
The 3rd of February.
Oh, so not long.
Yeah, so cute, really, isn't it? Yeah.
It'll come quick enough after Christmas. Once the night starts a bit lighter again. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So,
We've got a few more people coming through, Father
That's
Nicholas.
lovely. And nice to see you, Irene.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I come up as Cameron.
Yeah, that's fine. Well,
I don't know why.
Doesn't matter, but do you want to know how to change it?
Yeah.
Okay, if you click on the name, you move the cursor over to the name, it actually, if you get a whole drop down come in, and it lets you rename if you want.
No, it hasn't.
Okay, actually clicking on the word Cameron doesn't do anything.
Yeah, I was.
if you put your mouse over your picture and you've got 3 dots in the right hand corner in your picture,
Box, yeah.
Can you see there's 3 dots, and then click on those dots,
Gallery view.
and then we should say rename. Does it say rename?
No, it doesn't.
No, if you.
No, it just says speaker view, gallery view,
But
full screen.
the little box in which your picture is, so just your box where your face is, and if you can you see 3 dots if you move your mouse.
Hang on, I've disappeared.
Oh, hi, Dominic.
Good evening. Good evening.
I'll try again.
Hello.
I'm going to try and come in again.
Lovely.
All right, that's better. I haven't come up at all. Screen chat. Reactions. I'll play around with it and see what I can do.
There's probably more on there than you realise.
Hello. Hi, Angela.
Elena. Nice to see you.
Hi, Melina.
Hello. Father.
Hi,
Hello.
Tony. Nice to see you.
And you?
Lovely to
Nice to
see
see
you.
And Tony, that's a very nice collection of books behind you.
Substantial, rather more than I'm going to read, I think.
I can stop the video.
Tony, what room of the house is that? Is that an office or is it your sitting room? Or
No, it's it should have been a bedroom.
Okay.
But it's a study now.
Yeah.
Perfect.
And hello, Scott. Nice to see you, Scott and family. And Bill, good to see you. Hello.
Hi, Bill. Nice to see you too. And Maria, wonderful. We'll just give
Hi,
people
Dave.
another couple of minutes.
Hi guys, you're right.
Good to see you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Hi, Catherine. And Angela, have you enabled me to share my screen for a bit later?
Yeah, no, I'm just about to do that.
Fabulous. Hi, Liz.
Hello, Father.
Nice to see you.
And you too.
And actually, it's a good moment to mention that we're actually reopening for masses from Wednesday again.
Yes, we read that in the
Lovely.
church
So if
program,
you need
yes.
to book
Nice.
it, do let us know. And the Christmas masses will be going on very soon.
Okay.
There we go.
So, Scott, we can't fit all your family on one screen, can we? It's a bit of a squeeze.
That's wonderful.
There we go, nearly there.
Or your mum's coming on, Angela.
I think my mum's coming through. Brace, brace, everyone. Brace, brace.
Okay. Yeah.
Yes.
Evening, Father.
Hello, Rachel. Nice to see you.
Hi, it's Claire and Greg.
Hi, Claire and Greg.
Hey, look at
Nice to virtually see you. No, we're no camera in this evening.
That's absolutely fine.
That's
If
fine.
people want to turn their camera off, they're absolutely fine too. So it's as long as you can see Father Nicholas, that's absolutely fine.
Or rather, see my presentation when it starts. But we've got a few pretty pictures for you to look at. Hi, Sheila.
Yay.
Hi, Maria.
So he crossed off.
Hi, everybody.
Hello. He started walking.
Lovely to see you, Sheila. Nice to see you, Maria.
Alistair.
Hey,
Hi, good
listen to
evening,
this
Father.
Good to see you.
swaying grass
Good to
and
see you,
listen to
Father.
the trees. To me, the sweetest
Hi, Angela.
music is the
Lovely
branches
to
in the
see you,
trees.
Alistair. Hope it's
Nice to see
been a
you
good
too.
week.
Yeah.
I bought snacks.
Okay, so
that's good.
Maria's
Hi,
got
Bill.
the snacks. She'll be passing them around later.
Oh, Maria, won't that be the day? Hey, when we can do this in the hall again.
Oh.
Okay.
Perfect. Wonderful. Right, Father Nicholas, I think the people coming through have slowed up, so I suspect most people
Okay.
are here. But if any of you get disconnected, just try and reconnect again. I'm going to be watching for you all the way through. I'm going to mute everybody now, just so that that's it, so that we can just concentrate on Father Nicholas, but you will have to, Father Nicholas, unmute yourself. So if you do get disconnected, do try again. You don't need to have your camera on at all. As long as you can see Father Nicholas, that's great. If you would like to ask a question, there's going to be some question time at the end, but if you think of a question as you're going and you've got that chat facility, then just message me at the side and I will keep a note of the chat that's going on. It might be better to privately message so that it doesn't distract everybody else, particularly Father Nicholas as he's talking. So just look for me and send me a message and I will keep a note of all those questions. So without further ado, I'll introduce Father Nicholas. Lots of you probably don't know lots of his story. He grew up in Ealing and Rickmansworth. He was keen on history right from the start. His father was a historian and worked at the British Library. I think it's fair to say that you liked history from when you first went to a dentist. Is that right, Father Nicholas?
That's right, yeah.
And saw a poster of Charles II. And his mother very proudly told me this story. And Charles II had very long hair, and Father Nicholas, although this was the 70s, remember, so lots of men had long hair, he thought this was rather odd that a man had long hair, and this piqued his interest. So from then on, he was very into history. He studied modern history at Exeter College, Oxford. And being Oxford, modern history actually doesn't mean the 20th century. It means anything post-Roman. Okay, so he's got quite a big sweep there. He was at uni with, and don't let us put you off the talk, he was with Dominic Cummings and Matthew Hancock. So we're rather hoping he's got himself together this evening in a way that maybe they're struggling a little bit. He's the diocesan archivist for Westminster, which is the leading archive in the Catholic archive in the country, and that's where you disappear off to, isn't it, every Monday, Father Nicholas? You've done that for about 15
years, yeah,
something like that. You've written a good few books and you give lots of talks, but I think this is one of the first ones, if not the first one, on Zoom for the parish. And you are the fellow of the Royal Historical Society and the Society of Antiquaries, which he might tell you a little bit more about later. So that's Father Nicholas. He's sitting there looking very embarrassed, but if I don't tell them all, you certainly won't. So I'm going to make sure everybody knows. So without further ado, Father Nicholas.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I should add that I didn't know either Matthew Hancock or Dominic Cummings at university, but they were at the same college whilst I was there. So I guess we would have probably sat together at table or passed each other on the staircase, but I'm not in touch with them, so don't give me any messages to hand on. Now, shall I just share my screen? There we are. And can everyone see that? And one of the beautiful things about Zoom is you can see a few faces on the right-hand corner of your screen, but if you wish, you can minimize them by pressing that kind of line, and that means that you can see the whole screen. But I thought it's better to look at a few pictures rather than my face. Thank you so much for coming. It's wonderful to see so many of you at this Zoom talk. And as Angela said, it's kind of an inaugural talk. Perhaps we'll do a few more of these over the coming months. And it just makes life so much easier, doesn't it? You don't have to come down to the church hall on such a freezing cold evening. Angela and I don't have to set up tables and chairs, and we can do it nice and conveniently here on our computer. So what I want to do today, in the space of about 45 minutes, is look at the history of Catholic London. As we all know, London has a long, long history. And before we look at the Catholic history as such, I just want to share one thing with you, which I have mentioned to some of you, but I just find it absolutely fascinating. One of the earliest pieces of evidence of human history in London, and indeed England, is about 150 yards from where I'm sitting. Let me just show you this picture. Anyone recognize this magnificent modern building, Parexel building, which is in Uxbridge, just opposite the Crown and Treaty pub? And if you go over the bridge, you'll come to the Swan and Bottle and New Denham. I'm sure you've passed it many, many times. Did you know, I'm sure some of you do, but did you know that when they were building this office block, they found some really important archaeological evidence about hunter-gatherers who were living in about 10,000 BC, and they had spent at least a few days on this site, skinning animals, making tools out of stone, obviously having some kind of food because there's evidence of a fire and a hearth. And it's one of the earliest pieces of evidence for hunter-gatherers in England, and it's actually of European importance. And something that they found here as well are reindeer bones. So as we get a bit closer to Christmas, it's rather nice to think that at some point 12,000 years ago, reindeer were running up and down what is now my patio and what is now our church. And if you go to the Museum of London, which I strongly recommend, in the prehistoric gallery, there's a whole case about this site, a whole exhibit case, and it has a big thing saying hunter-gatherers in Uxbridge. So do have a look. So that's just to remind all of us that London has a very long and rich history. But when it comes to the Catholic history of London, well, it's a little bit less obvious, isn't it? Our Catholic history is largely hidden. If you go to the average Catholic church, it's not really that old. I mean, our church looks quite historic, but it's only 90 years old next year. So we have to have some kind of celebration for our church's 90th birthday. And some of our other surrounding churches like Hayes, Botwell, it's very, very modern in style. The oldest church in this immediate area is West Drayton, but that only goes back to the 1860s. Likewise, if you look at a list of the Archbishops of Westminster, it only goes back to 1850. That's when the diocese was founded. And if you get to know any parish, including our own parish, you'll realize that most parishioners trace their Catholicism either to a conversion or to another country. It's quite unusual to meet a family, an English Catholic family that's had the faith for many, many hundreds of years. So if you look at my family, my mother's side seemed to have converted to Catholicism about 100 years ago. And my father's side, well, their Catholicism came from Belgium because my Methodist grandfather fell in love with a Belgian girl at the end of World War I. And he brought her back to Manchester with him, and along with her, the Catholic faith. And most of our families can trace their faith back to Ireland, to Poland, to Nigeria, to some other country. So what I'm trying to say is that on the surface, it doesn't seem that our Catholic history is very long. Our churches are modern, our diocese is only 170 years old, and in many cases, faith comes from another country. But there are clues all around us about our Catholic history. And one of my favorite clues is the London Underground map. And sometimes when I'm sitting on the fairly long journey from Uxbridge into London, I look at the map and I try and spot evidence of our Catholic history. Some of them are more obvious than others. For example, Blackfriars Station. Well, it's named after the house of Dominican friars that used to stand near the site of the station in the Middle Ages. Covent Garden, well, the word Covent really comes from convent. It was the convent garden of Westminster. And another name on the overground line, Gospel Oak. Well, it takes its name from a tree which was a sort of landmark during religious processions and was probably part of a parish boundary. So if you look very carefully, you can see in place names, in station names, evidence of our Catholic past. So what I want to do today is to give you a broad outline of the history of Christianity in this area. And it's important because I think with history, often we know quite a bit of detail, but we don't have that perspective. You know, we might have watched hundreds of documentaries about Hitler and Churchill and that kind of thing, but it doesn't mean that we are experts on the Second World War. We might only know particular facts and particular individuals. And I think it's a great pity at schools, actually, that, you know, they look at all these different periods, but they don't always just have an overview of the last 2,000-3,000 years and where all the different bits fit in. So that's what I'm going to try and do today. And there are basically three essential periods over the last 2,000 years. The first one I call Catholic London. So it's a period when the whole of London, indeed the whole of England, was Catholic, with the exception of a few individuals and perhaps a few Jewish communities and that sort of thing, but everyone was a card-carrying Catholic. And I call this from St. Lucius, who's one of the earliest Christian saints we know, right up until the Reformation, that moment when Catholic England ended. Then I'm going to look at the Reformation, that time when England splits from Rome and becomes Anglican. And then finally, what we call the Second Spring. In other words, the Catholic revival of the last 200 years or so, and perhaps the period that we're most familiar with. So let's get stuck in and go back 2,000 years into our Catholic past. Now, for most people, if you ask them, when did England become Christian? They'd probably say, if they could answer at all, 597. Now that's, for Christians, that's a kind of 1066 date, 597. We should all know that date in our minds. Write it down on a bit of paper. 597. That's when Pope Gregory sent St. Augustine to convert the English. And I'll say a bit more about that slightly later. But what St. Augustine did was he converted the Anglo-Saxons, who were fairly new arrivals in England. But actually Christianity had existed long before 597 in this country. And some of this you can see in London. Here on your screen, you have two churches that you may possibly be familiar with. They don't look that old. In fact, they've both been rebuilt, but they claim to go back many, many hundreds of years. On the right-hand side, in the centre, on the right-hand side, that church is Old St. Pancras Church. So if you've been to St. Pancras Station, King's Cross, St. Pancras, come out of the station, turn right, go up a little side street, and it's kind of behind the station. And on the notice board there, it says that this has been a site of prayer and meditation since, wait for it, 314 AD. That's a long time ago. That's at a time when England was still under the Romans. And the other church on your screen, on the left-hand side, is one of the many city churches in the city of London, rebuilt by Christopher Wren after the Great Fire, St. Peter upon Cornhill. It's on Gracechurch Street. And if you look at the notice board there, it says it was founded in 179 AD by Lucius, the first Christian king of this land. So 179, that's what, 150 years after the resurrection. And this church is claiming that it was founded at that very early point. Now, I don't know whether you can see St. Lucius. He's on the extreme right of your screen. There's a kind of statue that you might just about see. He's a kind of legendary figure. He's meant to have been some kind of local leader. History has given him the name of king, but he was some kind of local leader. And the legend is that he wrote to the Pope in 179, asking him to send missionaries to London so that he could be baptized and so that he could build a church. And the church that he is said to have built in London is this church of St. Peter upon Cornhill. According to legend, King Lucius eventually abdicated his throne and he became a missionary in Switzerland, as you do. It's a rather bizarre story, but I always say there's no smoke without fire, and sometimes these very colourful legends do have a bone of truth in them. We certainly know for sure that there were Christians in Roman London. We know that there was a bishop in London because in the year 314, he went to a big church council in France. And there are bits and pieces of archaeological evidence as well showing that there were Christians in Roman London. Bits of pottery or pewter with the Chi symbol. Those are the first two letters of Christ's name. And in 1995, they were doing some digging in Tower Hill, close to the Tower of London, and they found a massive Roman building, which I think could have been a church or even some sort of cathedral, and bore some similarities to a cathedral of the same date, which you find in Milan in northern Italy. And it was eventually burnt down, possibly by the Saxons, and many of its stones were used to build the city wall of London, which you can still see in bits and pieces. So Christianity, this is really the main point. Christianity was present in the time of the Romans. And we don't know how Christianity first reached these shores. There are lots of legends, aren't there? But it was probably something rather unspectacular, like perhaps a Roman merchant or a soldier who came to this remote colony on the edge of the known world and brought with them their faith. Whilst talking about this very early period, we should mention St. Alban. Now, he's not strictly speaking a Londoner, but he lived quite close to London in the town of Verulamium, which is now called St. Albans. And I'm sure many of you have been there and seen the wonderful cathedral. The story is that he was a fairly well-known Roman citizen, and he hid a priest who was fleeing from persecution, a Christian priest. And while the priest was living in his house secretly, they spoke about the faith, and Alban decided to be baptized. And when the soldiers came to search for the priest, Alban put on the cloak that belonged to the priest and was arrested in his place and eventually beheaded very close to the site of the cathedral. And according to legend, as his head came off his body, the executioner's eyes fell out of their sockets as kind of divine punishment. That's the story anyway. But one of the most interesting things about St. Alban, I think, is that he may have suffered as early as 209 AD. So again, not that long really after the time of the apostles. Let's whiz forward now on our quick tour. We all know that the Roman Empire collapses at the beginning of the 400s, and Britannia still remained Roman in many ways, especially culturally. And one of the main signs of this continuity was the presence of the Christian faith and no doubt the existence of churches and bishops. But all the divisions in England after the Romans left made it quite vulnerable to attack. And a group of people that we call the Anglo-Saxons very quickly came to this country from northern Germany and Denmark, and they were pagan. So as they came to England and settled here, a lot of the Christians were driven out. Some of them went to places like Cornwall and Wales, which were strongholds of Christianity. Others went to Brittany in France, which is basically means Little Britain, Brittany. And if you go there, there are lots of saints with British and Celtic names. As far as London was concerned, the collapse of the Roman Empire meant that Londinium, the actual Roman city, became depopulated. The Saxons didn't move in to Roman London. And actually, when London eventually developed with the Saxons, it developed slightly outside the city of London at a place called Londonvic, which you can see on this map. It's kind of around the Strand and St. Martin's in the Fields, all around there. So they didn't go to the Roman city, they began their own settlement outside the city walls. So to some extent, London was in decline. But then, I earlier mentioned this magic date, 597, the date that should be in all your minds, the year that St. Augustine came to England to convert the Saxons and re-establish the Christian faith. St. Augustine landed in Kent near Ramsgate in 597. He baptized the king, St. Ethelbert, and once again, England had a strong Christian presence. And one of the companions of St. Augustine was eventually sent to London, and his name was St. Mellitus. Now, really, we should know St. Mellitus a bit better. You know, he's the first Saxon Bishop of London. He's the guy who founded the first St. Paul's Cathedral. So in a way, he founded the church in London as we know it. And yet most people don't know his name. There is one church in the diocese dedicated to him at Tollington Park, which is in North London. But I guess if you're not in that parish, you probably won't know very much about St. Mellitus. But he's the guy who came to London and established the first St. Paul's Cathedral. London was in a different diocese to Canterbury. And shortly after St. Mellitus founded a cathedral there was a pagan reaction, and St. Mellitus had to run away, and London became pagan for a brief time. But then we have another important bishop, St. Erkenwald, another rather strange name. He lived about 70 years after St. Mellitus, and he was able to re-establish the church in London once again. He rebuilt St. Paul's Cathedral, and he also founded abbeys at Chertsey and also at Barking. And the first abbess of Barking was the sister of St. Erkenwald, who had the wonderful name of St. Ethelburga. I love these Saxon names, and if you ever have a daughter or a granddaughter and you're not quite sure what to call her, I think Ethelburga is a pretty good idea. There are other saints ending with burger. There was Notburger and Withburger, but do remember Ethelburga. And there is a church in central London named after her. The City of London eventually begins to grow again, especially around the time of Alfred the Great. It becomes a centre of population, and Catholic London begins to develop with all its many churches and religious houses. And probably the two most famous churches in London were, of course, Westminster Abbey, which was just outside the city walls, which especially is connected with St. Edward the Confessor, one of our kings of England, and of course, old St. Paul's Cathedral. The St. Paul's that we all know today was built in the 1600s after the Great Fire of London. And we sometimes forget that there was an old, much older church on its site, which is called Old St. Paul's. And a 21st century visitor would be surprised by its splendour and its size, but also its hustle and bustle. The nave, so that the central aisle in the main part of the church, was known as Paul's Walk. And a lot of business was done here. Often you would go to St. Paul's Cathedral and walk up and down the nave and perhaps meet a business contact, or try and arrange something, walking up and down. It really was not just a centre of religion, but also a centre of everyday activity. The churchyard outside was a centre of the book trade, lots of publishers and booksellers. And there was a big cross in the cemetery, Paul's Cross, which was very important for open air sermons and various other ceremonies. So St. Paul's was really at the heart of the city. And actually it was the largest building in medieval England and the third largest building in medieval Europe. If you look at the coat of arms of the City of London today, it's a kind of red cross on a white background, but in the corner is a red sword, and that's the sword of St. Paul with which he was martyred. So it's a little reminder today in the City of London that St. Paul's is at the very heart of the city's history. There are many other churches as well in London. There are over 100 parish churches and 39 religious houses. This is in medieval London. Of course, most of it was destroyed in the fire of 1666. So today, if you go to London, it's quite a modern city in terms of its buildings, but once it was a rather picturesque medieval city, like the ones you might find in France or Germany or Italy. Some of the street names had religious motivations, like there's Amen Corner or Paternoster Row, Paternoster meaning Our Father. All the main religious orders were there. The Augustinians were at Aldgate. There was a Cistercian monastery near Tower Hill. And there was a charter house, a monastery of Carthusians near Smithfield, just outside the city wall, near what is now the Barbican station. So it was a very religious city, lots of churches, lots of religious houses. And there's evidence that the inhabitants of medieval London did take their faith very seriously. But the Middle Ages were a century of great changes and great action. And one thing remained the same, that was that at the heart of reality and society was the church. I should mention, we've been talking a lot about the City of London and central London, but let's also include where we're living right now, what we now call Greater London. And locally, you can see evidence of just the power and the influence and the splendour of the medieval church. So if you look at the top left-hand corner of the picture on your screen, you have the old church in Ruislip, St. Martin's Church, which has some medieval wall paintings if you go inside, which reminds us that originally medieval churches would have been painted, would have been very colourful inside, lots of images to look at, and you can still see a wall painting in St. Martin's. But Ruislip belonged to a Norman monastery, a monastery in Normandy called Bec. In fact, there's another part of London, Tooting, one of the stations there is called Tooting Bec, a reminder of this monastery in Normandy in northern France that owned a lot of land all over England, including in these places. If you go to Harmondsworth, which is close to Hayes, they still have a magnificent medieval barn, which you can see in the picture. It's known as the Cathedral of Middlesex. And Harmondsworth also belonged to a monastery in France for a long time, and then it was given to Winchester College, an educational foundation, again very closely linked to the church. And the final little local link is the bottom left-hand corner, Bishop's Halt School in kind of Uxbridge, Hillingdon. Perhaps some of your kids or your friends know that school, but the name tells us everything, doesn't it? Bishop's Halt. It was originally the house of the Bishop of Worcester, and he literally halted there. He stopped there on his way in and out of London. It was like a sort of staging post. And bishops had houses all over the country that they could use as they travelled around and as they went in and out of London. So a few local reminders there of the influence and the splendour of the medieval church. But these were times also of great tensions as well, and there were lots of conflicts between the church and the king. And perhaps the most celebrated case of this was St. Thomas Becket, St. Thomas of Canterbury, who you see in this picture. He lived in the 12th century. And actually, although we call him Thomas of Canterbury, at the time of his life, he was known as Thomas of London, because he came from London. He was born in Cheapside in the city of London, and that's where he started his life. He was basically a favourite of the king, Henry II. The king wanted to have more control over the church, so he came up with a fantastic idea. He'd make his best friend Archbishop of Canterbury. So Thomas Becket became Archbishop of Canterbury, but rather to the king's surprise, he decided to stand up for the church and not just let the king do anything he wanted. He defended the rights of the church and people's freedom to worship in the way they wanted. This led to huge conflicts between the king and the church, and St. Thomas was forced into exile for 6 years. And then when he eventually came back to England and went back to Canterbury, there was another misunderstanding and disagreement, and St. Thomas was murdered in his own cathedral by some of the king's knights. And this led to a huge kind of crisis for the king. St. Thomas was canonized just 3 years after he was murdered, and Canterbury became a major pilgrimage site. And perhaps that's most famously memorialized in the work of Geoffrey Chaucer and his Canterbury Tales, various stories told by pilgrims as they traveled from London to Canterbury. So there were tensions between especially the church and the state in this period. Now, by the 16th century, the 1500s, the church was in a fairly healthy state. Of course, there's always human weakness in the church at every period in history, but there was actually lots of priests, lots of churches being built. One foreign visitor said that the citizens of London attend mass every day and say their rosaries in public. People would go on pilgrimage. Many churches had organizations called guilds. In fact, the church in Uxbridge had a guild, and it was a kind of organization for the laity. It was partly a prayer group arranging masses for people. It was a charity, it was a social club, it was a trade union, a bank. It fulfilled lots of different functions in society. And once again, it was based around the church. Some of the first printed books, remember, printing was sort of invented in the 15th century, and the first printed books, they weren't novels, they weren't cartoons or comics, they were religious books, like the popular Golden Legend, which had the stories of the saints. And the monasteries, which you could find everywhere, the monasteries did an awful lot of work for the poor and the sick and the marginalized. And then all of a sudden, in the 16th century, things change. It's the period we call the Reformation, and it's largely connected to perhaps one of the most famous faces in English history, King Henry VIII. Now, you could give a whole series of talks on the Reformation, on why England split from Rome and became essentially a Protestant country. Suffice to say that the Reformation basically divides Europe into Catholic and Protestant countries. It was partly linked to personal faith, of course, and the influence of Martin Luther and Calvin and all the other Protestant reformers, but it was also very closely linked to politics. Religious matters were seen as affairs of state. That wouldn't be the case today. It wouldn't matter what religion the king or the queen or the prime minister has. It's just seen as a personal thing. But 400 or 500 years ago, religion was a much more public thing, and it was linked to things like the identity of citizens and the security of the state. It was a really big matter. So that's why Henry VIII's own personal difficulties regarding his marriage could affect the whole of English religious history. And as you all know, Henry didn't have a son, an heir. He'd been married to Catherine of Aragon for well over 20 years. He tried to arrange an annulment so that he could remarry somebody else, Anne Boleyn, and hopefully he would have a son with her. But the Pope said, sorry, your marriage is valid. We just can't annul it like that. And so Henry essentially declared himself head of the church in England and granted himself this annulment, married Anne Boleyn, and in doing so split with the church. It's also worth mentioning that many of the advisors of Henry VIII at this time were influenced by the Protestant reformers who were criticizing the church and kind of trying to move some of our beliefs in a new direction. And these people around Henry included Thomas Cranmer, who became the first Protestant Archbishop of Canterbury, and also Anne Boleyn herself, who was very much into the writings of the reformers. So it was a mixture of faith and politics at work. The effect for Catholics, though, was fairly obvious. The monasteries were being closed and in many cases pulled down. In fact, many of the monasteries in London were given to the king's supporters, partly to kind of buy off their support at this very critical time. So, for example, the Charterhouse, the former Carthusian monastery, was given to Lord North, one of the courtiers at Henry's court. At the same time, many of the shrines of England were destroyed, like Our Lady of Walsingham, or for Londoners, Our Lady of Willesden, a very popular shrine just outside London. People would often go there for a day pilgrimage. There was a statue of Mary that people prayed to. Again, that was destroyed, that shrine, and the statue burnt on a big bonfire in London. So the whole structure of religion in England was changed. Some people, of course, were very resistant to all this. Perhaps the most famous example of resistance was St. Thomas More, who you can see on the left-hand side, Henry VIII's Lord Chancellor, pretty much like a modern prime minister in some ways, but he refused to recognize Henry as the head of the church in England, and eventually he was put to death in 1535. And then on the right-hand side, you can see some of the Carthusian monks from London who also were put in prison, and some of them were put to death in that horrific way, being hanged, drawn, and quartered. And you can see that in the background of that painting. But in some ways, it was a very confusing time for people, and on the local level, things didn't change so quickly. Okay, they would have known that the king had declared himself head of the Church of England, but for the whole of Henry VIII's reign, the Mass was still said in Latin. Many of the old ceremonies remained the same. It wasn't completely obvious what was going to happen. It wasn't completely obvious that there was this new thing called the Church of England. And also the English were used to battles between the king and the church. And we saw in the example of Thomas Becket that this is something that's remained at the very centre of our history. Things change with each of Henry's children, but perhaps a really critical moment comes with Elizabeth I. So she's Henry VIII's youngest daughter, and she reigns between 1558 and 1603. And perhaps the most important thing about Elizabeth I is that she was queen for a very long time, 45 years. So she let the dust settle after the Reformation, and the Church of England became much more consolidated and part of the nation. And I think most people just hoped that the Catholics, who are now a tiny minority, those who didn't go along with the new changes, they just hoped the Catholics would die out. and that by the time you got to the 1600s, there'd be no Catholics left, and everyone in England would be an Anglican, a Protestant. But the amazing thing is that the Catholics did remain as quite a sizable minority. Even some of the leading aristocrats remained loyal to their Catholic faith. Having said that, many Catholics went into exile. So there's this thing which historians call the English Catholic diaspora. Now, a diaspora is a group of people from a country who are living overseas. And in the 16th and 17th centuries especially, there are lots of English Catholics living in places like France and Belgium and Italy and Germany, in places where you can practice the Catholic faith freely. And there's a whole string of Catholic colleges, English colleges, set up to provide an education for young Catholics and also train priests for the priesthood. And there were lots of convents as well, both men and women, that were real centers of Catholicism and places where prayers were made for the conversion of England. And of course, the fact that new priests were being educated meant that the church, the Catholic Church, wouldn't die out, because they were then sent back to England to build up the church and to say mass and provide the sacraments. And it meant that the church in England was not going to die out as the government hoped. Despite the tiny number, though, of English Catholics, the idea of Catholicism was really big. Basically, from Elizabeth I onwards, the public enemy number one in this country was Catholicism. People were nervous about the Catholic threat, which in a way you can understand, because England was this little Protestant Ireland, and all its immediate neighbours, more or less, were very strong Catholic countries, like France and Spain. Don't forget that Spain ruled what is now Belgium and part of what is now the Netherlands. So on all sides, it seemed that this little nation, England, was surrounded by Catholics. And as we all know, there were various attempts by foreign powers to intervene and overthrow the Protestant king or queen and replace the monarchy with a Catholic leader. The most famous example, of course, was the Armada of 1588, this big invasion sponsored by Spain to overthrow Elizabeth I and replace her with a Catholic. And another notable example of Catholics getting involved in politics and being a threat to the regime in England was the Gunpowder Plot in 1605, when Guy Fawkes and his Catholic conspirators tried to blow up Parliament. And it's been estimated that if they had succeeded, if they had blown up Parliament, most of that bit of Westminster would have been affected. Probably Westminster Abbey would have been destroyed as well, in addition to the Houses of Parliament. And the death toll would have been probably more than that of 9/11. So it would have been a really awful terrorist outrage. And it's kind of understandable that Catholics were seen as a threat, as something that we wanted to kind of eliminate in this country. Catholics became associated with treason and conspiracy. And it actually became treason, which is one of the worst crimes possible, simply to be a Catholic priest working in England. You didn't have to do anything. You didn't have to sort of say anything radical or do anything radical. Just to be arrested as a priest was enough to send you to your death. And we all know that about 200 or 300 Catholics in this period were put to death because they were feared to be traitors, spies, conspirators. Most of them were innocent of the plots that were alleged of them, but it was a risk that any Catholic had to make if they were kind of going about their faith in this country. One of the martyrs, one of these Catholics put to death, was St. Edmund Campion, whose feast we celebrate next week. And he has a link with Uxbridge because he spent a few weeks living in Uxbridge and attending a big meeting for some of his fellow priests that was held here. Uxbridge was seen as kind of fairly safe. It was, outside of London. It was on some quite main roads, but also there was lots of countryside around. So there were actually quite a few secret Catholics in this area. Edmund Campion and the house that he used in Uxbridge is one example. In West Drayton, the Paget family, they were Catholic in the 16th century. And down in Harlington, there was a very famous Catholic musician called William Byrd, who is a famous composer, and he lived in Harlington, wrote music for Catholics who were worshipping secretly, and is still recognized today as one of the greatest composers our country has ever produced. Perhaps the really bizarre thing about this period, and here we're kind of moving into the 1600s a bit more, is that despite all these laws against Catholics, despite Catholics being put to death, you could actually find Catholicism in the royal court. And that's because a lot of kings of England in the 1600s were married to Catholic princesses. The reason they married was really political reasons, to kind of ally with countries like France or Portugal. But if you've got a Catholic queen in England, well, she needs her chaplains, she needs her own chapel. So even though it was illegal to go to mass in London and in the rest of England, many Catholics were able to go to mass at court, at the court chapel. And in fact, one of the chaplains at the royal court was the guy on the right-hand side, St. Claude de la Colombière. He was a French Jesuit priest. And before coming to London, he was spiritual director to St. Margaret Mary, one of the most famous saints of the period. She's famous because she had those visions of Jesus and the Sacred Heart. And the modern Sacred Heart devotion partly comes from him and from St. Margaret Mary. So, and also Catholicism could be found in the embassy chapels. All the foreign embassies from Catholic countries, they also had their own chapels and were able to have quite splendid services sometimes. So it was a funny mixture. Catholicism was illegal, priests were put to death, and yet you could also go to mass fairly safely in the embassies and even at the royal court. Now, I'm going to kind of whiz forward a bit more now. Things begin to get easier at the end of the 17th century. And one thing that happens in 1685 is that we're given a bishop, a Catholic bishop. Because England is a place of persecution, they decide not to have a diocese because it's kind of mission territory. It's not really a normal Catholic country. So they made a bishop with a kind of missionary title, which is Vicar Apostolic. If you go to some parts of the world where the Catholic Church is very young and it's still developing, you'll find that the bishop is called a Vicar Apostolic rather than a bishop. It's a missionary bishop. And in the 1680s, England gets a missionary bishop, and England is divided into 4 different districts, each one with a bishop, or as we call it, a Vicar Apostolic. One of the most famous of these Vicars Apostolic was Richard Challoner, who lived in the 18th century. He was a great scholar. He did much to build up the church and establish schools. And he even translated the Bible into English. And he's still very much remembered, especially in London, for all the work he did at this period when Catholics were slowly beginning to come out of the woodwork, if you like, and exercise their religion slightly more openly. Now, we're going to move to our final period, because I think my 45 minutes is kind of coming to a close very quickly. How long do I have, Angela?
Well, you're nearly at 45, but I think people are quite interested, so you keep going. It doesn't switch off. You're all right.
So we're now in the 18th century, and things are getting a bit easier for Catholics. And this is partly because there are lots of challenges at this time to the old order. So you've got the American War of Independence, which means that America separates from the British Empire. This is seen as a massive challenge to things that people just took for granted. How dare a colony, become independent? You've got the ideas of the Enlightenment, the idea of kind of reason and veering away from superstition and some of the customs of the past. And then you have the French Revolution, which is a radical purge of things that people just took for granted: monarchy, aristocracy, the church as it was. So all of a sudden, the old differences of Catholics versus Protestants that date back to the time of Henry VIII, they don't seem quite so serious. the public enemy number one, perhaps, is not so much Catholicism, it's revolution and radical politics. And in fact, in the French Revolution, a lot of French priests came to England to escape the revolution, to escape the guillotine. So even though England was a Protestant country, even though technically England still persecuted Catholics, they welcomed hundreds and hundreds of French priest refugees to our country. And they were seen as heroes who were escaping revolution. And some of them actually founded some of our parishes in London. So the parishes of Hampstead, Somerstown near Euston, Tottenham and Kensington trace their origins back to these priests who came from France at the time of the revolution. And even two future kings of France were in England for a time as refugees, King Louis XVIII and Charles X, and they would attend Mass in London at one of the French chapels. This kind of change in people's attitude and increasing ideas of toleration leads to a series of parliamentary acts starting in the 1770s, which make life much, much easier for Catholics. So, for example, in 1791, which isn't really that long ago, but in 1791, it was okay to open a Catholic school or a Catholic church. It didn't have to be done quite so secretly. And then in 1829, Catholic emancipation meant that Catholics could actually take public office. They could, for example, be an MP or join the army. Having said that, these acts of parliament led to quite a bit of opposition from especially the more radical Protestants. In 1780, for example, there was a big riot in London called the Gordon Riots, which led to one of the Catholic churches in London being burnt down. And one of the priests in that church is said to have died from the shock. So Catholics were still sort of widely misunderstood. So even though they were tolerated and there were more and more Catholic churches being opened, they were still viewed with a certain amount of suspicion. And in fact, when Westminster Cathedral was built much, much later, and they saw the foundations being built, some people in London genuinely thought that these were going to be dungeons for the Spanish Inquisition that was going to be established in London along with Westminster Cathedral. So there's still a certain suspicion about Catholics aren't really to be trusted and they're not real English men and women. A big change in our country, though, comes in 1850 when Pope Pius IX, who you can see here, at last restores the system of dioceses. So we're not seen quite so much as a missionary church. We have a proper ecclesiastical organization, and all the dioceses that we're familiar with are founded, including Westminster. The map, by the way, is slightly misleading because some of these dioceses have been founded since 1850. But yeah, the basic map and the basic idea is there. We're becoming increasingly part of the country. The first two Archbishops of Westminster are particularly notable, and we should mention them briefly. The very first Archbishop of Westminster was Cardinal Nicholas Wiseman, who you can see on the left-hand side. He belonged to an Irish family. He was actually born in Seville in Spain, where his family had settled, and he spent most of his young adulthood in Rome, both as a student and then as a teacher at the seminary there. He was quite a famous scholar. He wrote novels, he wrote all sorts of books, but eventually he returned to England as a bishop. And he's particularly remembered for kind of bringing over with him some of these Italian devotions that he would have been familiar with in Rome, things like benediction, Vespers and benediction, or the 40 hours devotion of the Blessed Sacrament. And although he was a rather temperamental character, he did fall out with quite a few people. He very much established the modern Catholic Church in London. And then his successor was Cardinal Manning, Henry Edward Manning, who you can see on the right-hand side. He was a convert from the Church of England. Rather like Newman, he was a very prominent Anglican cleric. Some people predicted he might become the Archbishop of Canterbury, but he decided to become a Catholic in 1851, and again was really respected. He was useful because he had links with the establishment, unlike a lot of Catholics at the time. So he is actually a personal friend of Gladstone, who eventually became one of the great Victorian prime ministers. So all those contacts were quite useful. And he also had a great bond with the poor. And in fact, at the close of his life, he made a really important intervention in the dock strike in London. Let's not forget, London is still a very important dock, and the dockers went on strike. It really threatened to kind of threaten the economy at the time, but Manning really solved the issue and brought the whole thing to a resolution. So two real giants in our Catholic history. Of course, more locally speaking, this is the time of parish expansion. It's amazing to think that in 1826, which is less than 200 years ago, in the whole of London, there were 24 Catholic churches, just 24 Catholic churches. By 1863, there were just over 100. And within 100 years of this Catholic revival, most areas of the country, and certainly most areas of London, would have a church and a school and probably some sort of convent as well. It was a real kind of rapid development and growth. And often these parishes began very simply, perhaps in a private house, and then eventually they'd build a temporary church, and once they had enough money, build a church from stone or bricks. In fact, in our case, we were founded from West Drayton, which was the only church in what we now call the borough of Hillingdon up until the 1890s. And in fact, West Drayton began in a stable, a very humble stable, and then eventually they were able to build a big church. Our church, when it was established, they had to build a temporary chapel made out of corrugated iron. That was there for about 30 years. And then once they had enough money, they built the church that we all know and love today. But in many cases, the priority was not building churches, it was building schools. So in Uxbridge, the first thing they did was build St. Mary's School in the late 1890s. And then once that was set up and established, they concentrated on building the church. So we now have reached our modern times, and, you know, we've come a long way in 200 years. When you think that priests were still being imprisoned in the late 18th century, now we're very much part of our country. Westminster Cathedral is very much part of the London skyline. And many Catholics have made a great contribution to our society and to our culture. When you think of people like Edward Elgar or Oscar Wilde or J.R.R. Tolkien or G.K. Chesterton or Hilaire Belloc or Evelyn Waugh, all really famous Catholics who have contributed to our country, especially through their writings and their art. But of course, the amazing thing about history is it gives us all a responsibility, doesn't it? We're all links in a chain. It's wonderful to admire the last 2,000 years and all the stories of heroism and vision and courage. But now the baton has been passed to you and me. We're the ones now making our story, and we have to make sure that we hand on the baton to future generations and that people will look back with gratitude to what we do. So I think that's probably my 45 plus minutes up. So shall we return to the main screen?
Absolutely.
And,
to stop your sharing, Father Nicholas. Well, before we give you a vote of thanks, I'm sure there may be the odd question out there. I've certainly got one already from Sheila. Very good question. Never thought of this one. If these priests in Elizabethan times were going abroad to train as priests because they weren't allowed to here, why didn't Elizabeth I stop them going abroad? How did they get there, and why did she let them out, and why did she let them in?
Fantastic. Thank you, Sheila. That's a really good question. And she actually tried to stop them. It was actually made illegal to travel overseas unless you had permission and unless you had a reason for going overseas. But, you know, these guys were pretty cunning. They would often use disguises and false names. They kind of paid their way onto ships. And likewise, when they came back to the country after their education, they didn't kind of arrive like this with a big kind of collar saying, "Hello, everyone, I'm a priest." They would dress up as a servant or as a as a teacher or something else, and only reveal who they were once they were in the house of a Catholic. But that's a really good question, Sheila.
Yeah, brilliant. Anybody else got a question? Just kind of hold your hand up if you have. Louise has got one. Fire away, Louise. Unmute yourself.
Unmute myself. Hello, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yep,
Yep,
you, Louise.
Absolutely.
Yep. The only question I have is it curiosity. If you mentioned, and I'm trying to remember everything you said, was it a bishop or someone called Urquhart?
Oh yeah, Urquhart. Yeah.
Urquhart. Where did he come from?
Good question. I think he was, this is one of these bizarre Anglo-Saxon names, you know, so I think he was a Saxon, so he would have been living in England. They have a very different sort of language to us and lots of bizarre names. So I think he was originally German in his family, but would have been living in England.
And the other more question while I've got the chance is, the Manning chap you mentioned at the end, who's sitting on the second spring of your topic. How old is he in that painting?
I think
he looks very old.
Yeah, he looks quite skeletal, doesn't he? And
yes.
he was he lived a very sort of ascetic life. He didn't sort of overindulge in his food and drink, and in fact he was a key promoter of the temperance movement, so he didn't touch a drop. So he lived a very strict life and was quite thin and kind of gaunt and skeletal. I think that picture's at the end of his life, so he's probably in his 70s or 80s.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Louise.
Thanks, Louise. Are there any other questions? Just raise your hand if you've got a question. I'm flipping around screens in case I miss anybody. Oh, Tony Little. If you unmute yourself, Tony.
Yeah. Thank you very much for the talk, Father. In the London area, in the Reformation, at the time, say, of Elizabeth I, would there have been very many Catholics outside the court?
Thank you. That's a very good question. I think there were, it's one of the big questions is how do you define a Catholic? And there are various degrees. There were what we call recusants, and I'm sure many of you have heard of that. Recusants, in other words, people who refuse outright to go to their local church and who practice their faith secretly at home. And often these are people who have large houses, large estates. These are the people who have, you know, secret hiding holes for priests in their attic. But then you get people who are called by historians church papists. In other words, they go to their Church of England every Sunday, because if you didn't go to the Church of England, you had to pay a fine. But then secretly, in all sorts of ways, they would practice their faith. So there are probably lots of church papists. Well, when I say lots, I mean a substantial minority of people who remain loyal to some extent to their Catholicism. I think we're talking, probably hundreds, well, probably thousands in London, perhaps, of Catholics. But the only evidence we have are those who were actually arrested, that those who didn't go to church and therefore were noted by the authorities. But certainly there's quite a bit of sympathy in Elizabethan times for the old faith, and plenty of men who go overseas and are trained to be priests and come back and have enough work to do there.
Okay, thank you very much, Father. I think Maria's got a question. Maria O'Callaghan, and I think Alistair's next.
Thank you, Father. Thank you, Angela. So my question was, this may have been covered already, so apologies if it has been, but how old is Westminster Cathedral? It would just be really interesting to get a bit more history on that, given that it's such a important, landmark in London and for the Catholic faith as well.
Thank you, Maria. That's a really good question. So Westminster Cathedral is only about 120 years old. I think it was built in 1903. Again, the priority for Catholics in the 19th century were founding parishes and building schools. And although there was an idea to build a cathedral from quite an early stage, they realized this wasn't the number one priority. When Catholics were ready to build a big church in the center of London, brilliant, but let's concentrate on building parishes and schools. Before Westminster Cathedral was built, they had what was called pro-cathedrals, in other words, temporary cathedrals. So the first one was St. Mary Moorfields, which is in the City of London, still exists, near Liverpool Street Station. That was the temporary cathedral. And then under Cardinal Manning, that rather kind of gaunt, skeletal bishop we were talking about earlier, his cathedral was Our Lady of Victories in Kensington, which again still exists. So kind of prominent churches in London were nominated as temporary cathedrals, but Westminster Cathedral itself was only built in 1903, I think, or thereabouts. And I think the amazing thing about Westminster is, when you think about it, you know, it's quite courageous and possibly slightly imprudent to build your new spanking Catholic cathedral just down the road from the Houses of Parliament. And the name Westminster, you know, is probably the most controversial name you could choose in London. If it was like Chelsea Cathedral or Barnet Cathedral, yeah, it wouldn't bother anybody. But Westminster Cathedral, the place where the King and Queen are crowned and where the laws are made, it's really kind of getting at the establishment. And you can imagine why a lot of English people were a little bit nervous about this big Catholic church being built down the road from Buckingham Palace and Parliament.
Yes, it's really interesting how it wasn't just named after, say, you know, a saint.
Yeah, I think its official dedication is the Precious Blood, but yeah, it's just called Westminster Cathedral.
Thank you very much.
And it was deliberately built in that quite exotic style of architecture. It's based on kind of Hagia Sophia in Istanbul and the kind of Greek Byzantine style. And they did that deliberately because, you know, you couldn't really compete with Westminster Abbey down the road. You know, any church built in 1903 would not be quite as nice as Westminster Abbey. So they deliberately did something a bit different.
Well, it's an interesting mix because so you have the different chapels inside as well. So,
and they built it because it was fairly quick to build, and then they left it to future generations to decorate it. And as you know, we're still decorating it, and it'll probably take another few hundred years to cover the whole space in mosaic.
Yes.
I think, Father Nicholas, isn't it built on a former prison? Isn't that how we managed to get hold of the ground?
It is, yeah. So there would have been quite a few lunatics there some 200 years ago.
Still the odd one occasionally passes through now, but you know. But I think that's how the Catholic Church, because we didn't really ever have much money, how we managed to get such a prestigious plot was that nobody else wanted it. Because it was, I think it was a former lunatic asylum as well. It's a big old bit of space they've got there in London. Right, Alistair, you had something, didn't you, to ask?
Yeah, just a quick one, Father. Was it any time in the history of Catholic faith in UK where there were catacombs, basically where Catholics had to practice the faith underground? Never heard of catacombs in UK.
Brilliant, thank you, Alistair. Yeah, the catacombs are very big in Rome, aren't they? I think that's partly because the again, I need to look it up, but I think the rock in Rome it makes it fairly easy to dig these big tunnels and catacombs. Perhaps in London it's less easy, but no, there's no evidence of that in London. Certainly Christians in the Roman times would have been persecuted. We know that St. Alban was put to death in that 209. There were almost certainly many others who suffered. In fact, the town of Lichfield in the Midlands, apparently that the name means field of blood. And the tradition is that hundreds of Christians had been put to death in Lichfield under the Romans, you know, but they hid in different places rather than catacombs. And you could say that the Elizabethan Catholics and the Catholics of the 17th century, they sort of had their own catacombs, but they hid in sort of country houses, and for the priests actually had their own hiding holes built behind panels and in chimneys, and they were sort of catacombs, weren't they? But not in the Roman sense. But good question, Alistair. Thank you.
Thank you, Father Nicholas. Is there anybody else who'd like to ask a question? Just raise your hand. I'm flipping around a couple of screens, so bear with me if I don't see you. No, I think we're coming to the end. Okay, well, Father Nicholas, what a journey we've been on. I don't think any of us are going to forget the year 597 ever again, or St Augustine and Canterbury. And I will remember to remind Sammy that my future granddaughter needs to be called Ethelberga. I don't think he's going to be mad keen on it, but I'm going to try for us. But what a journey you've taken us on, all the way through Old St Paul's and the Canterbury Tales, the Reformation. It has been really, really interesting. So thank you. Thank you. And it just leaves me to say that we are going to have another talk like this on Tuesday, the 15th of December. We're getting as close to Christmas as we can. And the title of that talk, Father Nicholas?
Where do our Christmas traditions come from? And I thought, because we can do it at home through Zoom, we might even be able to sing a few carols as well.
Ooh, okay. You're leading, I take.
Yes, Father Nicholas is. I'm not. I'm tone deaf, Louise. So you won't get me singing unless we're on mute. But yeah, you'll be pleased to hear. But yes,
we'll practice. We'll practice.
So we just thought it would be lovely to hear a little bit more about our Christmas traditions. So we'll do exactly the same thing again. We'll put the link out there. Now, if anyone would like this emailed to them, we are recording it. So do send me an email in the next day or so, and I will send you this email back. And I'm hoping that Emma, who is still on here, Emma is our techie guru. She is going to try and put this onto YouTube tomorrow. We weren't allowed to do it live onto YouTube because of the copyright issues for a lot of that art that Father Nicholas was showing. But apparently, if it's not live, we can put it out there. So I think that's one of Emma's tasks of tomorrow. Once we've compressed it down a bit,
I will do it tomorrow.
Thanks, Emma. So when you get messages all over the place, it's Emma that does that. Father Nicholas and I, it's not our strength, but Emma's our lady. So thank you ever so much, Emma.
Thank you.
That just leaves us to say thank you ever so much for attending. Absolutely marvellous to see you all. Hopefully we'll see you all over the next few weeks down at the church again, which will be lovely. And see you on the 15th on here again, hopefully.
Thank you.
Thanks, Angela. Thank you.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Not at all. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.